clink of the spoon against the side of Elliot's coffee mug was the only sound in the kitchen. Sophia sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for him to speak. The silence between them had become its own language over the years. Tense, empty, final. Sunlight streamed through the window behind him, highlighting every wrinkle on his face, every line she had once memorized with love. He wouldn't look at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, not angry, not cold, just detached. "If I'm honest, I regret marrying you." Sophia didn't blink. The sentence didn't need repeating. It didn't need emphasis or clarification. It was heavy enough to break something inside her that had held on for too long. She didn't ask why. She didn't argue or cry. She stood up slowly, steadying herself against the table for just a second, and walked out of the kitchen. Upstairs in their bedroom, everything was in its place. Their bed neatly made her robe hanging on the back of the door, his cufflinks resting in the glass tray on the dresser. 40 years of shared space of routines and roles of raising 2 children and weathering storms. All of it suddenly felt borrowed, like she had been living someone else's life. She opened the closet and reached for her suitcase. It had dust on the zipper. Every movement was deliberate. She packed with quiet hands, folding clothes. With care, not because she planned to come back, but because she still respected what they once were. As she placed her worn diary into the side pocket of her bag, she hesitated. That diary had held every moment she couldn't say out loud, every humiliation she'd absorbed with grace, every celebration no one remembered, every night she'd cried quietly into her pillow. But she changed her mind. She took the diary out, walked over to her nightstand, and tucked it gently into the drawer. Maybe it belonged there in the home she had built in the story she was no longer willing to live. Downstairs, Elliot remained seated, staring into his coffee, as if it might offer a different answer. He didn't ask her where she was going. He didn't try to stop her. For a man who claimed to regret their entire marriage, he looked oddly calm. Or maybe just relieved. She picked up her keys, opened the door, and walked out into the bright morning light. The air was crisp. The sky was clear. The world didn't stop. It never does. She didn't slam the door. She didn't leave a note. She left with everything she needed and none of what she didn't. Before those words shattered her world, Sophia believed her marriage, though quiet and predictable, was steady, secure. She'd often told her friends, "We're not flashy, but we're solid." And for most of their 40 years together, she thought that was true. They had routines. They had history. They had a life that felt, if not thrilling, at least dependable. Sophia met Elliot Harrington when she was 22, a newly certified teacher with too many books and not enough furniture in her 1-bedroom apartment. He was older by 3 years and already running his father's hardware business. He had a calm confidence about him, the kind that made her feel safe. He wasn't overly affectionate, but he was steady, the type of man who never forgot to take out the trash, always filled her car with gas before a storm, and never raised his voice. They married in the spring. She wore her sister's wedding dress, and he built their first dining table by hand. They weren't wealthy, but they worked together side by side and slowly built a home. Sophia left her job when their daughter, Isabel, was born, and then again when their son, Nathan, arrived 3 years later. It wasn't a sacrifice, she told herself. It was love. It was motherhood. It was what women did. Elliot worked long hours, especially in the early years. She understood. He was providing for them. She was the constant, the one who packed lunches, made birthday cakes, sewed, Halloween costumes. She kept their family's wheels turning so he could keep them afloat. Every Sunday morning she made pancakes and coffee, and they'd all eat at the table together. Their sacred tradition, even as the kids got older and the world pulled at them. As time passed, Sophia began to take pride in the invisible work, the little details no one else noticed. Matching socks in every drawer, fresh sheets every Thursday, the way she remembered how Elliot liked his eggs, not too runny, not too firm. She memorized every preference, every quirk, every silent cue. When the kids left home, the quiet settled in. She had imagined that they'd travel, or take up gardening together, or at least enjoy the slow pace of empty nesting. But Elliot grew more distant, not closer. He buried himself in news shows and financial articles, often grunting responses to her questions, or leaving the room mid-conversation. She assumed it was stress or just the long road of marriage, a natural settling. Not every love story stayed passionate right. Still, she found joy in small things. She joined a book club with her friend Vivian, volunteered twice a week at the library, and began experimenting with recipes she'd never had time to try. When she made something new, she always served it with a hopeful smile, waiting for Elliot's approval. Sometimes he gave it. Sometimes he didn't even notice. There were good days, too. Times they'd sit in the backyard sipping iced tea while the dog chased squirrels, or lazy Sunday morning when he'd bring her a coffee just the way she liked it. Those days mattered. She clung to them. They were proof that love hadn't completely left the house. Looking back, Sophia realized how much of her identity had wrapped around making others comfortable, smoothing over silences, filling in the emotional blanks, pretending things were fine. She had taught herself to treasure crumbs. A compliment here, a smile there. She never demanded more. She thought it was enough to be dependable, to be the one who never gave up. When Isabel got married, Sophia helped plan every detail, from floral arrangements to seating charts. Elliot just signed checks and showed up in a tux. Isabel barely acknowledged her effort in the thank you speech. Dad worked so hard to make this day happen. She'd said Sophia smiled through it, clapping with the crowd, her heart quietly wilting inside her. And yet Sophia never stopped believing they were a team, that what they had was real, that love was meant to evolve, even if it sometimes faded around the edges. She never prepared for the day when Elliot would look her in the eye and reduce 4 decades of partnership into a regret. Because despite all the signs, the silences, the indifference, the hollow smiles, Sophia had still believed in them until he spoke, and her entire past tilted under her feet like a trapdoor. Sophia Elizabeth Collins had always been a dreamer, born in a small town where expectations for women were as narrow as the main street. She had quietly harbored ambitions that extended beyond marriage and motherhood. Her mother, Margaret, had been a piano teacher who gave up her music when she married Sophia's father, a stern accountant who believed a woman's place was in the home. As a child, Sophia spent hours in the attic, surrounded by her mother's abandoned sheet music and watercolor paintings, wondering why someone would give up the things that made their eyes light up. She promised herself she would never make that sacrifice. In high school, Ms. Winters, her art teacher, had seen promise in her sketches and encouraged her to apply to art school. "You have a unique perspective, Sophia," she'd said. "The way you capture light, it's special." But when Sophia brought home the application forms, her father had laughed. "Art doesn't pay bills." He said, "Teaching is a sensible career for a woman. You can work until you marry, and if needed, go back after your children are in school." His words weren't unkind, just practical, shaped by his generation's understanding of the world. So Sophia compromised. She majored in elementary education with a minor in art, dreaming of classrooms where she could inspire children, the way Ms. Winters had inspired her. College was a revelation. Ideas flowed freely. Professors encouraged critical thinking, and for the first time, Sophia felt the exhilaration of being valued for her mind rather than her domestic capabilities. She bloomed during those years, staying up late discussing philosophy, with classmates joining protests against the Vietnam War, painting bold, abstract pieces that expressed emotions she'd been taught to suppress at home. Her roommate Caroline introduced her to feminist literature that put words to feelings Sophia had carried her whole life. You don't have to choose. Caroline insisted during late-night conversations, you can have a career and a family. You can make art and money. The world is changing, Sophia. She believed it then in the heady atmosphere of campus life in the early 1970s. Anything seemed possible in that bubble of optimism and revolution. But when she graduated and returned to her hometown to teach third grade at Jefferson Elementary, reality reasserted itself. The world might have been changing in big cities and on college campuses, but in small-town America, traditional expectations held firm. She was 22, living alone for the first time in a tiny apartment above the drugstore, decorating with thrift store finds and plants she nurtured on her windowsill. Most evenings she worked on lesson plans or graded papers, but some nights she set up an easel by the window and painted what she saw: the changing leaves in autumn, the snow-covered streets in winter, the faces of her students captured from memory. She didn't date much. The men her age were either already married or seemed intimidated by her independence. She didn't mind. She was building a life that felt meaningful. Her students adored her, and the principal had praised her innovative teaching methods. On weekends, she drove to the nearest city to visit art galleries, attend poetry readings, or simply wander bookstores for hours. Then came the hardware store incident. A leaky faucet in her apartment had driven her to Harrington's Hardware one Saturday morning. The store was busy, filled with weekend warriors gathering supplies for home projects. Sophia stood bewildered in the plumbing aisle, trying to decipher the difference between washers and gaskets. "Can I help you find something?" The voice was deep, authoritative, but not condescending. She turned to find a tall man with serious eyes and capable hands. "My faucet won't stop dripping," she admitted. "I thought I could fix it myself, but I'm completely lost." He didn't laugh at her ambition the way many men might have. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully and began gathering items from the shelves. "It's usually a worn washer," he explained, showing her a small rubber ring. "I can explain how to replace it, or..." He hesitated. "I could stop by after closing and take a look for you." "No charge. I'm Elliot, by the way. Elliot Harrington." His offer wasn't flirtatious. It was matter-of-fact, practical. Something about his steadiness appealed to her. She'd known too many volatile men, her father's unpredictable moods, college boyfriends who burned hot, then cold, and Elliot's calm certainty felt like solid ground. He came by that evening, fixed the faucet in 10 minutes, refused payment, but accepted her invitation to stay for coffee. They talked until midnight, not about politics or art or philosophy, but about simpler things: his plans to expand the store, her students' antics, the best fishing spots in the county. He listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and when he finally left, Sophia felt a warm contentment settle over her. Their courtship was conventional by the standards of the time: weekend dates to the movies, or the diner Sunday drives in his pickup truck, occasional dinners with his parents who clearly adored him, or her father, who grudgingly approved of Elliot's business acumen. He kissed her goodnight at her door, but never pressed for more, respecting boundaries in a way that made her feel valued. On their third date, she showed him her paintings. She'd been nervous remembering how her father had dismissed her art. But Elliot studied each canvas carefully. "You see things differently," he said finally. "You make ordinary things look important." It wasn't effusive praise, but it was genuine. And in that moment, Sophia thought she might be falling in love. Not with wild passion, but with a gentle certainty that felt sustainable. Besides, she told herself, weren't the great love stories in novels always? A bit dangerous, a bit destructive. Maybe real love was quieter, steadier. When he proposed 6 months later, presenting her with his grandmother's modest diamond ring, Sophia said yes without hesitation. She was in love, certainly, but she was also making a practical choice. Elliot was kind, stable, respected in the community. He didn't drink or gamble. He never raised his voice. He spoke of partnership, of building a life together. "I want you to be happy," he told her, slipping the ring on her finger. "Whatever that means for you," she believed him. She had no reason not to, and that night she wrote in her journal, "I think I've found someone who will let me be myself, who will support my dreams as I support his. We'll build something beautiful together." How could she have known then that support and permission are different things? That letting her be herself would gradually transform into tolerating her peculiarities. That dreams deferred often dissolve rather than wait patiently for their time. But on her wedding day, standing beside Elliot in her sister's ivory gown, altered to fit her smaller frame, Sophia felt only hope. The spring sunlight filtered through the church windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. Her third-grade students sat in the front row, giggling and waving. Elliot looked handsome in his dark suit, his eyes warm as he promised to cherish her all the days of his life. She believed those promises. They both did. That was the tragedy of what would unfold over the next 40 years. Not that they had lied to each other, but that they had failed to understand how time and complacency could erode even the most genuine intentions. The first time Sophia truly questioned her place in Elliot's heart, it was such a subtle moment. It might have slipped past unnoticed if not for the way it stayed with her, long after everyone else had forgotten. It was their 25th wedding anniversary. Isabel and Nathan had both flown in for the weekend, and Vivian had helped Sophia prepare a small dinner party. She wore a soft blue dress Elliot once said brought out her eyes. She curled her hair, dabbed on the perfume he used to buy her for Christmas, and set the table with their wedding china, the set they only used once a year. Elliot arrived home late. He walked in, wearing a frown, muttered something about traffic, and kissed her cheek distractedly. His tie was crooked. He hadn't even changed. Sophia noticed the absence of a gift, but said nothing. She didn't want to make him feel guilty. That had never been her style. Throughout dinner, he told stories about work, about a client's new boat, about how tired he was of city taxis. The guests laughed politely. He was still charming, still able to fill a room with his presence. But Sophia noticed something new. Not once did he mention her. Not their anniversary. Not their years together. Not the children they'd raised or the life they had built. She smiled through it anyway. After dessert, someone raised a toast. Vivian clinked her glass and said, "Here's to Sophia and Elliot. 25 years and still going strong." There were cheers and someone asked Elliot to say a few words. He stood, adjusted his tie, and gave a small smile. "Well, I guess we've made it," he said. "A quarter century. That's a long time to tolerate anyone." A few people laughed. Sophia tried to, he continued. "I mean, you marry young. You figure it out as you go, right? You settle in. Get used to each other's weird habits. Eventually, it becomes easier to stay than to leave." Sophia's heart sank. There was no "I love you," no gratitude, no reflection. Just a casual public declaration that their decades together were little more than endurance. When he sat down, he didn't even glance at her. That night after the guests left, Sophia cleaned the kitchen while Elliot turned on the television. She stood at the sink, hands submerged in warm water, wondering what she had missed. Had she imagined their closeness? Had he always felt this way? She wanted to ask, but the words lodged in her throat. She told herself it was the stress of the evening, that he didn't mean it that way, that he was tired. But the truth hovered there in her mind, unspoken. Their first year of marriage had been a delicate dance of adjustment. They moved into a small starter home on Maple Street, with a postage stamp yard and creaky floorboards. Elliot worked long days at the hardware store, learning every aspect of the business, from his father in preparation for eventually taking over Sophia, continued teaching returning home each afternoon, to grade papers at the kitchen table while preparing dinner. Those early days had a sweetness to them, the novelty of waking up beside each other, the shared satisfaction of their first major purchases, a couch they saved for 6 months, to buy a set of matching lamps found at an estate sale. The slow process of merging 2 lives into one. They were building something together, brick by brick. On weekends, they worked side by side on home improvements. Elliot taught her to sand wood and hang wallpaper. She chose colors and patterns that transformed sterile rooms into cozy spaces. They weren't always in sync. He prioritized function over form, while she insisted that beauty mattered too. But they found compromises that satisfied them both. Their first major disagreement came when Sophia was offered a position, teaching art at the community center on Tuesday evenings. "I think I want to take it," she told Elliot over dinner. "It's only 1 night a week, and the extra money would help with the mortgage." Elliot frowned. "Who would make dinner on Tuesdays?" The question caught her off guard. "I could prepare something ahead of time," she suggested, "or you could make yourself a sandwich." He nodded slowly as if considering a complex problem. "I guess I could manage. But what about when we have children? You won't be able to work evenings then." They hadn't discussed children yet, not in concrete terms, though both assumed they would start a family, eventually. His presumption that her schedule would be the one to accommodate future children wasn't surprising. It was the 1970s after all. But something in his tone suggested this wasn't open for debate. "That's years away," Sophia said carefully, "and we'll figure it out together when the time comes." In the end, she took the position, and for nearly 2 years, she thrived teaching art to adults who came to the community center seeking a creative outlet. On those evenings, she felt most like herself, not Elliot's wife or her student's teacher, but Sophia the artist, sharing knowledge she was passionate about. Elliot never complained directly about her Tuesday absences, but he developed a habit of calling the center at least once each session with questions about where she kept the spare light bulbs or whether they had any clean towels. Small interruptions that reminded her he was waiting, slightly inconvenienced by her absence. When she became pregnant with Isabel, 3 years into their marriage, the art classes were the first thing to go. Not because Elliot demanded it, but because morning sickness stretched into all-day nausea and fatigue overwhelmed her by dinner time. She told herself it was temporary, that she could return to teaching art after the baby was born, but motherhood consumed her in ways she never anticipated. Isabel was colicky for the first 3 months, crying for hours each evening, only soothed by constant motion and Sophia's soft singing. By the time their daughter finally began sleeping through the night, Sophia had lost touch with her art center colleagues, and the position had been filled by someone else. "It's for the best," Elliot assured her when she expressed disappointment. "Isabel needs you at home, and I need you too." He smiled, pulling her close. "Besides, you can always paint during her nap times." But nap times were filled with laundry and dishes and meal preparation. Sophia's easel gathered dust in the corner of their bedroom. Her paintbrushes stiffened from disuse. Occasionally, she would sketch Isabel, sleeping quick studies in charcoal that captured her daughter's perfect profile, the curve of her tiny hand. Those moments of creation sustained her small reminders of who she had been before motherhood claimed her identity. When Nathan arrived 3 years later, the household rhythm shifted again. 2 children under 5 demanded constant attention, constant vigilance. Sophia's days blurred together, diapers and tantrums, skinned knees, and bedtime stories. She loved her children fiercely, delighted in their milestones, treasured their uniqueness, Nathan's serious concentration as he built block towers, Isabel's infectious laughter as she danced to records in the living room. Elliot was a good father in the ways men of his generation understood fatherhood. He roughhoused with the children on weekends, took them fishing in summer, built Isabel a dollhouse for Christmas, and taught Nathan how to ride a bike. He provided financially ensured their home was safe and warm, expressed pride in their accomplishments. What he didn't do was notice the slow dimming in Sophia's eyes. He didn't see how she sometimes stood at the kitchen window staring into the distance, momentarily lost in thoughts of what might have been. He didn't recognize that her cheerfulness was increasingly performative, a mask she wore to conceal growing restlessness. When both children entered school, Sophia considered returning to teaching. She mentioned it casually one evening as they sat in the living room, Elliot reading the newspaper, she darning socks. "I was thinking of applying for part-time positions at the elementary school." She said, "Now that Nathan's in kindergarten." Elliot lowered his paper. "Is there something you need that I'm not providing?" The question wasn't hostile, just genuinely confused. In his mind, a woman worked out of necessity, not desire, and he was providing well. Their home was comfortable. The children had everything they needed. There was even enough for an annual summer vacation to the lake. "It's not about money," she tried to explain. "I miss teaching. I miss having something that's mine." He studied her for a moment, then sighed. "The kids need you after school. And with my longer hours at the store, I need you handling things at home." He reached for her hand. "You're irreplaceable here, Sophia. No one else can do what you do for this family." His words were meant as a compliment, an acknowledgement of her value. But they landed like a prison sentence. Irreplaceable meant stuck confined to roles. She performed well, but that didn't fill her completely. Still, she nodded and smiled, accepting the invisible bars of his good intentions. Instead of returning to formal teaching, Sophia channeled her energies into volunteering at the children's school, at the church, at the hospital auxiliary. She joined the PTA and eventually became president, organizing fundraisers and advocating for arts education. She created elaborate Halloween costumes from scratch, planned themed birthday parties, kept a vegetable garden that supplied their table through summer and fall. She made herself busy, useful, needed. She built friendships with other mothers, particularly Vivian Morris, a straight-talking woman who had divorced her philandering husband and now ran the local bookshop. Vivian was unapologetically independent, raising 2 daughters alone and running a successful business with an acerbic wit that Sophia found refreshing. "You've got to carve out something just for you," Vivian advised during one of their coffee dates, watching Sophia obsessively check her watch to ensure she wouldn't be late for Nathan's dismissal, even if it's just an hour a week. Something that's not about them. Sophia laughed half-heartedly. "There aren't enough hours in the day. Make them." Vivian insisted. "Or you'll wake up at 50 wondering who the hell you are, besides someone's wife and someone's mother." The words haunted Sophia, but she didn't know how to create space for herself without shortchanging her family. Her own mother had sacrificed her passions without complaint. Wasn't that what good wives and mothers did? Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was slipping away. Year by year, moment by moment, she began rising before dawn, stealing quiet moments with her sketchbook while the house still slept. She joined a book club that met monthly at the library, reveling in discussions about worlds beyond her own. Small rebellions against the shrinking of her identity, but not enough to disrupt the carefully balanced ecosystem of their family life. Elliot noticed these changes but didn't comment. As long as dinner was on the table, the children's needs were met, and the household ran smoothly. He was content. Their marriage settled into comfortable patterns, predictable rhythms of work and home, occasional date nights, family vacations, holiday traditions. They rarely argued. They made love less frequently as years passed, but still regularly a physical connection that temporarily bridged their growing emotional distance. They functioned as a team, efficient and practiced, raising children who thrived, maintaining a home that others envied for its warmth and stability. From the outside, the Harringtons appeared to have achieved the American dream: successful business, beautiful children, active community involvement, financial security. Even Sophia sometimes convinced herself that her restlessness was ingratitude, that she should be thankful for what many would consider a perfect life. But in quiet moments when insomnia claimed her sleep, or when she found herself alone in the house, rare occasions that became treasured oases, she would take out her old journals and read entries from her college days. The passionate young woman who had believed in her ability to change the world through art and education seemed like a stranger now, a road not taken, a self left behind. Who would I have become? She sometimes whispered to her reflection, if I hadn't compromised so much so often. The question had no answer, only echoes that reverberated through increasingly hollow years. From that night on, small shifts began to multiply. She noticed how he would interrupt her mid-sentence, finishing her thoughts with dismissive guesses. How he started rolling his eyes when she reminded him of errands or appointments. How he never asked about her day. And when she volunteered details, he would respond with, "That's nice," without looking up. Once, while she was reading a new novel she was excited about, she tried to share a passage with him. He waved her off, saying, "You always get too emotional about these things." When they were at a neighborhood barbecue, someone asked Sophia what she had been doing with her time now that the kids were gone. Before she could answer, Elliot chimed in. "She's become a professional worrier, always organizing something, can't sit still." The men chuckled. It was the way he said it, not cruel, just careless, like she was background noise, like she no longer mattered. And that's when Sophia started to wonder, when did she stop being a partner and start being an accessory? She still cooked dinner every night, still left him little notes on the fridge, still rubbed his shoulders when he came home sore. But something had shifted. His appreciation had evaporated. Not with anger, but with indifference. He had stopped seeing her. Or maybe he chose not to. But Sophia saw everything. She just didn't want to believe it yet. So she told herself it was a phase, that long marriages went through this, that love like old floors creaked under pressure, but still held the weight. She patched over the cracks with hope, with history, with habit. But deep down, something had already started to fracture, and she knew even then that one day it might break completely. It wasn't one big betrayal that broke Sophia's spirit. It was the slow, persistent peeling away of her presence, like wallpaper curling off a wall unnoticed, until the room felt bare. Elliot never yelled. He never hit. He didn't cheat. At least not in the obvious sense. Instead, he withdrew in pieces. The teenage years brought new challenges. Isabel once. Sophia's shadow grew distant and critical, adopting the cutting sarcasm that seemed mandatory for adolescent girls in the late 1980s. She rolled her eyes at Sophia's suggestions, mocked her mother's modest clothing choices, and saved her smiles for Elliot, who indulged her whims and seemed amused by her rebellion. "You're too strict with her," he would say, after Sophia enforced curfews or insisted on meeting boyfriends. "She's just finding herself." But Sophia recognized something deeper in Isabel's criticism. A daughter watching her mother closely, deciding what kind of woman she would become by defining herself in opposition. "Don't be like her. Don't settle. Don't disappear." The unspoken message in every dismissive gesture cut Sophia deeply, not because it was cruel, but because it reflected fears she harbored about her own life choices. Nathan was different, quieter, more introspective with his mother's artistic sensibility and his father's pragmatism. He spent hours drawing elaborate comic book worlds in his bedroom, emerging for meals with ink-stained fingers and faraway eyes. Sophia recognized herself in his creative absorption, his need to escape into worlds of his own making. She became his defender when Elliot expressed concern about his solitary nature. "He's fine," she would insist. "He's just processing the world in his own way." She kept his best drawings in a portfolio, encouraged his storytelling, and found graphic novels that expanded his understanding of what art could achieve. When Nathan won a regional art competition at 15, Sophia drove him to the ceremony while Elliot attended a hardware retailers conference in Chicago. She sat proudly in the audience as her son accepted his award, recognizing the moment as bittersweet validation. Her artistic genes finding expression through her child, the path she hadn't fully walked now open to him. As the children grew toward independence, Sophia attempted to reclaim pieces of herself. She took a watercolor class at the community college, joined a hiking group that explored local trails on Saturday mornings, volunteered at the art museum in the next town over. Small rebellions that Elliot tolerated with minimal comment as long as his comfort remained undisturbed. Their 20th anniversary came and went with little fanfare. A dinner at the same restaurant they visited every year. An exchange of cards containing pre-printed sentiments. Sophia had once imagined they might take a second honeymoon at this milestone. Perhaps visit Europe as they'd talked about in their early years. But Elliot was occupied with expanding the hardware business to a second location, and such extravagances seemed impractical now. "Maybe for our 25th, he said when she mentioned it. But they both knew it was an empty promise, a convenient postponement of dreams that had already faded beyond recognition. When Isabel left for college, the house felt emptier than Sophia had anticipated. She wandered her daughter's room, touching abandoned posters and high school mementos. Wondering where the years had gone, Nathan would follow 2 years later, accepting a scholarship to art school that made Sophia's heart swell with vicarious pride and a touch of envy. "You're going to have too much time on your hands," Elliot remarked one evening as they prepared for Nathan's departure. "Maybe you should get a part-time job." The suggestion startled her after years of subtle discouragement. Why was he suddenly supportive of her working outside the home? She soon understood with both children gone, her constant presence in the house felt unnecessary to him, perhaps even intrusive. He had grown accustomed to solitude during his work days, and now wanted more space in his personal life. Sophia did find work, not because he suggested it, but because she needed purpose beyond waiting for his return. Each evening, she began teaching art to elementary students 3 days a week, and rediscovered the joy of nurturing young creativity. Her students' uninhibited expression reminded her of what she had gradually lost, the courage to create without concern for judgment. She started painting again in earnest, converting the spare bedroom into a modest studio. Her technique was rusty, her confidence fragile. But the act itself, brushed to canvas color, emerging from blank space, revived something essential in her spirit. She joined a local artists' cooperative, displaying small landscapes in their quarterly exhibitions. Elliot never attended these shows. He nodded absently when she mentioned them, offering generic encouragement that felt perfunctory. "That's nice, dear. I'm sure they're wonderful." But he never asked to see her work, never inquired about her progress or process. Once she sold a painting for $300, not a fortune but validation from a stranger who found value in her vision. She came home elated, eager to share the news. "Someone bought my sunset piece," she announced as Elliot sorted through mail at the kitchen counter. "The larger one with the birch trees." He glanced up briefly. "That's good. Will they want more?" "I don't know. Maybe." Her excitement dimmed slightly at his practical response. "I was thinking we could use the money for a weekend trip to the coast. Just the two of us." He frowned, checking his calendar. "I've got inventory that weekend, and then the fishing trip with Jim the weekend after. Maybe in the fall." Another postponement. Another dream deferred. Sophia nodded and moved to start dinner, the familiar routine reclaiming her momentary deviation into possibility. As they entered their 3rd decade of marriage, the distance between them grew more pronounced. They still shared a home, a bed, a history, but increasingly lived parallel lives that intersected only at mealtimes and social obligations. Sophia cultivated friendships, especially with Vivian, whose blunt assessments of Sophia's situation sometimes stung with their accuracy. "He takes you for granted," Vivian stated plainly during one of their coffee dates. "And you let him." "It's not that simple," Sophia defended, though the words felt hollow, even to her. "We have a comfortable life." "Many women would envy what I have," Vivian snorted. "Comfortable isn't the same as fulfilling. And what exactly do you have, Sophia? A man who barely sees you. A life where your dreams come last, if they register at all." The words burned because they contained truth. But what was the alternative? Start over at 50, dismantle 4 decades of shared history, because she felt underappreciated. It seemed selfish, unreasonable. Besides, there were good moments too, when Isabel announced her engagement, and they hosted the celebration in their backyard when Nathan's first professional illustration appeared in a national magazine when they sat beside each other at the neighborhood Christmas concert, and Elliot reached for her hand during the final carol. These moments sustained her like oases in an increasingly arid emotional landscape. She clung to them, evidence that something real and valuable remained between them, even as silence claimed more territory in their daily interactions. When Elliot's father died after a brief illness, Sophia glimpsed the vulnerable man behind the stolid facade. He wept in her arms the night after the funeral, allowing her to comfort him in a way he rarely permitted. For a few weeks afterward, he seemed softer, more present, reaching for connection. In small gestures, a hand on her shoulder, as she cooked questions about her day that seemed genuinely interested in the answer. She thought perhaps this shared grief might bridge the chasm between them. But as he processed his father's death, Elliot retreated further into work, taking over complete management of both hardware stores and spending longer hours at the office. Availability became absence. Vulnerability hardened back into stolid self-sufficiency. By their 25th anniversary, Sophia had mastered the art of lowered expectations. She no longer dreamed of European vacations or passionate reconnection. She hoped merely for acknowledgement, for evidence that her presence in his life mattered beyond the functions she performed. The dinner party she planned was modest, close friends. Their adult children good food and wine in the home they had shared for decades. She wore blue because he had once years ago complimented her eyes in that color. A small gesture of hope, of invitation to see her again, as he once had. His lateness stung. His distracted kiss on her cheek felt obligatory. But it was his toast, casual in its dismissal of their years together, framing their marriage as mutual tolerance rather than chosen connection, that finally crystallized what she had been avoiding for years. Elliot didn't love her. Not in any meaningful way. Not anymore. Perhaps not for a long time. The realization didn't arrive as dramatic revelation. It settled over her gradually, like evening shadows, lengthening across a familiar room, transforming known objects into something less recognizable, less comfortable. That night, as she washed dishes that could have waited until morning, she studied her reflection in the darkened kitchen window. A stranger looked back, a woman of undetermined age with tired eyes and a smile worn thin from overuse. Not the bright-eyed teacher who had once believed in possibility. Not the passionate artist who had seen beauty in ordinary moments. A faded version of herself diminished by years of accommodation. Is this all? She whispered to her reflection. The question hung unanswered in the quiet kitchen, but something shifted inside her. A subtle realignment like tectonic plates adjusting beneath the visible surface of her life. She dried her hands, turned off the light, and went upstairs to bed, where Elliot already slept, facing away from her side. As she slid beneath the covers, careful not to disturb him, Sophia made a silent promise to herself to pay attention, to catalog the small dismissals, the casual erasures, the moments when she disappeared from her own life. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity, because naming something is the first step toward changing it, or accepting that it cannot be changed. At first, it looked like forgetfulness. Then it started to feel like erasure. It began with mornings. He used to hand her a cup of coffee, always, the way she liked it. A splash of cream. No sugar. Now he'd brew his own, pour one mug, and walk past her without a word. When she asked if he had time to eat breakfast together, he'd shrug. "I've got emails." She still made his eggs anyway. They often went cold on the plate. He stopped saying goodnight. That was the one that stung the most. For decades, no matter how tired or distracted he was, Elliot had always mumbled it, sometimes from the bathroom, sometimes already half asleep, but it had been their ritual. One night, Sophia whispered, "Good night," as she climbed into bed beside him. No response. She waited. Nothing. He was awake. She knew he was awake, but he said nothing. The next night, she said nothing too. And so, the silence grew roots. He started scheduling dinners with friends and clients without telling her. She would learn about them when he was halfway out the door, buttoning his jacket casually, saying, "Oh, I'll be late tonight." When she asked if she should wait up, he said, "Don't bother. You hate these work dinners anyway." That wasn't true. She used to love getting ready, putting on her favorite earrings, hearing him brag about her homemade desserts. But he hadn't invited her in over a year. On Sundays, she still made pancakes. He stopped coming down until they were cold. He had excuses, always work or fatigue, or just not in the mood. He wasn't unkind, just absent like a ghost in the house, like someone who used to know her, but had since forgotten. When she mentioned feeling lonely, he told her she was too sensitive or reading into things, so she stopped mentioning it. Her birthday came and went without a card. When she reminded him gently, he looked annoyed. "Do we still do that? I thought we agreed not to make a big deal of birthdays." They had never agreed to that. In fact, the year before, she had spent an entire afternoon baking his favorite German chocolate cake. He didn't ask what she wanted for dinner that night. She microwaved leftovers and ate alone at the kitchen counter while he watched TV in the den. Every now and then, Sophia would find herself staring at her reflection in the hallway mirror. Not looking for beauty, just checking if she still looked like someone worth noticing. She started buying small things for herself. A silk scarf, a new book, a lavender lotion. Not because Elliot would notice he didn't, but because it reminded her she still existed. Isabel called occasionally, always in a rush. The conversations revolved around her own children, her job, her stress. Sophia listened, gave advice, reassured her. She didn't mention how quiet the house had become, how sometimes whole days passed without Elliot saying more than a sentence to her. She didn't want to seem needy. Nathan texted more often than he called quick updates, emojis, a photo of his dog. Sophia replied with warmth, always ending with, "Miss you," which he usually didn't answer. She understood he was busy. Everyone was busy. One afternoon, she spent hours cooking a roast. Elliot walked in, sniffed the air, and said, "That smells heavy. I'll probably just have a salad." She stood at the stove, spoon in hand, and nodded as if that didn't feel like a slap. That night she ate alone again. She started writing more. In her diary, she chronicled the absence, the little moments of being ignored, the times she felt like furniture. She didn't write with rage, just clarity, cold, honest clarity. Each entry ended the same way. "Still here, still me." Vivian noticed. "You're disappearing, Sophia," she said one day over coffee, piece by piece. Sophia smiled sadly. "I know, but I don't think he even sees the difference." That was the ache Sophia carried. Not that Elliot stopped loving her, but that he didn't even notice she was fading. She had spent decades making his world run smoothly, quietly keeping everything together, and now she was just background. She used to feel like a partner. Now she felt like a shadow. It was a Saturday in spring, the kind of day that should have felt light and full of promise. Sophia had been planning the family brunch for weeks. As Sophia entered her 60s, she noticed a peculiar phenomenon. She had become increasingly invisible, not just to her husband, but to the world at large. Waiters directed questions to Elliot. Even when she had placed the order, store clerks looked past her, to assist younger customers. Doctors spoke about her symptoms as if she weren't in the room. This public erasure echoed her private one, creating a disorienting sense that she was fading from existence entirely. She began to wonder if she had become a ghost, haunting the periphery of other people's lives, without making an impact. One Tuesday afternoon, as she waited at the pharmacy counter for a prescription, the young technician called next, while looking directly at her, then served the man who had arrived after her. When Sophia politely pointed out she had been waiting, the technician blinked in surprise as if suddenly noticing her presence. "I'm so sorry," the girl stammered. "I didn't see you there. The incident might have been insignificant, a simple oversight, but it resonated with dozens of similar experiences." Sophia had reached the age where women became background characters in the cultural narrative useful primarily as grandmothers or caregivers, their individual desires and personalities deemed irrelevant to the larger story. She wondered if Elliot felt similarly invisible as he aged, but evidence suggested otherwise. At community events, people still sought his opinion, listened attentively when he spoke, acknowledged his presence with handshakes and backslaps. His gray hair and deepening wrinkles conferred distinction rather than dismissal. The world still had use for aging men, particularly those with financial means and community standing. On her 60th birthday, Sophia woke before dawn and studied her face in the bathroom mirror. The lines around her eyes had deepened, silver threaded prominently through her once auburn hair, but her eyes remained keen, observant, alive with intelligence and curiosity. She was aging, certainly, but she was not diminished. "I see you," she whispered to her reflection. A simple affirmation, but one she needed desperately in a world that increasingly looked through her rather than at her. That day she made a decision. She drove to the salon in the next town over where she wasn't known as Elliot Harrington's wife or Isabel and Nathan's mother, and asked for a complete makeover. The stylist, a woman about her own age with vibrantly hennaed hair, smiled appreciatively. "What are we thinking? Something bold?" Sophia nodded. "Bold, different me, but more visible." 3 hours later, she emerged with her hair cut into a stylish bob and colored a rich chestnut with subtle auburn highlights. The stylist had also given her a makeup lesson showing her how to emphasize her eyes and add color to her face without appearing overdone. When she arrived home, Elliot was in his usual spot in the den reading the newspaper. She stood in the doorway waiting for him to notice. Several minutes passed before he glanced up. "Oh," he said, blinking. "You changed your hair." "Yes," she replied, waiting for more. He nodded once, then returned to his reading. "Looks nice." That evening at dinner, he didn't mention it again. But when she went to the grocery store the following day, the male cashier held her gaze a moment longer than usual. A woman in the produce section complimented her hair color. The barista at the coffee shop smiled warmly as he handed her the latte. Small acknowledgments of her presence, her visibility from strangers. It shouldn't have mattered so much, but it did. It reminded her that she still existed beyond the walls of her increasingly silent home, beyond the narrow role she had been assigned in her marriage. She began making other changes, subtle at first, then more pronounced. She updated her wardrobe, replacing shapeless comfort clothes with well-fitted garments in colors that complemented her complexion. She pierced her ears a second time and bought small silver hoops that caught the light when she moved. She started wearing the jewelry she had stored away, pieces too bold or impractical for her daily routine. When Vivian suggested they join a group traveling to Santa Fe for a week-long art retreat, Sophia agreed without consulting Elliot first. She simply informed him over breakfast. "I'll be gone the second week of October. Vivian and I are attending a workshop in New Mexico." He looked up from his tablet with genuine surprise. "A whole week? What about the hospital auxiliary fundraiser? You'll have to send my regrets." She replied, a calm finality in her tone that discouraged argument. The retreat transformed her. Surrounded by other artists, many of them women in midlife or beyond, who had reclaimed creative pursuits after years of family obligations, Sophia felt understood in a way she hadn't for decades. They painted in the desert, light discussed, technique and inspiration, shared stories of deferred dreams and rediscovered passions. Her work received thoughtful critique and genuine appreciation. One instructor, a nationally recognized watercolorist, took particular interest in her landscapes. "You have a distinctive eye for light." He told her, studying her painting of dawn breaking over the desert. "There's honesty in how you capture transition, the moment between night and day, between seasons. You're seeing thresholds that others miss." Sophia returned from Santa Fe changed, not dramatically, not in ways obvious to casual observation, but fundamentally shifted in her relationship to herself. She had glimpsed another possible life, one where her perceptions mattered, where her creative expression was valued, where she existed as a complete human being, rather than an adjunct to others' lives. She displayed her paintings from the retreat in the spare bedroom that served as her studio. Elliot never ventured there, so they remained private treasures, evidence of a self he didn't know or care to discover. But Nathan visited at Thanksgiving and spent nearly an hour examining her work, asking questions about her process, encouraging her to submit to local exhibitions. "These are really good, Mom," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You've developed a distinctive style." His words warmed her more than any compliment she had received in years. Her son, the professional artist whose work now illustrated major publications, saw value in her creative expression. It validated something essential that had nearly been lost in the long drought of her marriage. As winter approached, Sophia felt an internal shift, accelerating a growing certainty that she could not continue, as she had been fading year by year into translucence. She began making plans vague at first, then increasingly specific. She researched art communities in coastal towns, looked into workshops and residencies, explored rental costs for small apartments near artist colonies, not with immediate intention to leave, but to remind herself that alternatives existed, that she had choices beyond slow erasure, that the world was wider than the narrowing corridor of her marriage. She said nothing of these explorations to Elliot. Their communication had dwindled to practical exchanges about household matters, occasional updates about the children, and necessary social coordination. He rarely inquired about her thoughts or feelings anymore, so her internal landscape remained her own private territory, increasingly populated with possibilities he couldn't imagine. One evening, as winter darkness fell early outside their windows, Elliot mentioned casually that he was considering partial retirement. "The new manager at the second store is doing well," he said. "I might cut back to 3 days a week by summer." "That sounds sensible," Sophia replied, folding laundry at the kitchen table. "Do you have plans for your extra time?" He shrugged. "Golf, probably. Maybe finally take that fishing trip to Montana with Jim. We've talked about it for years." She nodded, waiting for him to ask about her plans, her wishes for their shared future. The question never came. In his vision of retirement, she remained what she had always been, a constant presence in the background of his life, available when needed, invisible when not. That night, lying awake beside his sleeping form, Sophia confronted a truth she had been circling for months. Elliot would never see her fully again. Whatever had dimmed in his perception of her could not be re-illuminated by her efforts or patience or hope. The man who had once built her a bookshelf and fixed her leaky faucet now looked through her as if through glass. The realization brought surprising calm rather than despair. If she could not be seen in this marriage, she would need to see herself more clearly, to reclaim her visibility, even if only in her own eyes, to remember that she existed beyond the roles she performed, beyond the silence that had become their shared language. She turned away from his sleeping form and whispered into the darkness. I am still here. I still matter. I am not done yet. The words felt like a declaration of independence, quiet but unequivocal, a boundary drawn in the territory of her remaining years. She did not yet know what action would follow this internal manifesto, but something had clarified in her purpose. She would not disappear completely. She would not go gently into that invisible night of aging womanhood. The next morning she rose before dawn and took her sketchbook to the kitchen window. As gray light gradually revealed the winter landscape, she drew what she saw: bare branches against brightening sky, frost patterns on the glass, a cardinal's sudden flash of color at the feeder. Elliot found her there an hour later, so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear his approach. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't interpret. Curiosity, perhaps, or simple confusion at finding her engaged in something outside their routine. You're up early, he finally said, moving toward the coffee maker. She nodded without looking up from her drawing. The light is better at dawn. He made no response, just continued his morning ritual, as if she had said nothing significant. But something had shifted, not in him, but in her. She had spoken her truth, however small, without apologizing or explaining, without seeking his approval or understanding. It was a minute rebellion invisible to anyone but herself. But like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground, it signaled the possibility of growth to come, of renewal after a long season of dormancy, of life reasserting itself against the deadening weight of neglect. Isabel and her husband were bringing the kids. Nathan was flying in from Chicago for a quick weekend visit, and even Elliot seemed mildly interested when she mentioned it on the calendar. She poured herself into the preparations, fresh flowers on the table, blueberry muffins from scratched linen napkins folded into little fans. She wanted it to feel special, not just for them, but for herself. It had been a long time since their home felt joyful. Elliot didn't help, but she didn't expect him to. He never offered any more. He came down late already, dressed in his golf polo, fiddling with his phone as he poured himself a glass of orange juice. Sophia, still in her apron, greeted him with a hopeful smile. I made everything you like, she said, setting a hot tray of quiche on the table. He looked over it briefly. Didn't we have this last year? The comment stung, but she brushed it off. It's Isabel's favorite, she replied, setting down the silverware. The doorbell rang. Isabel entered with her usual distracted energy kids tumbling behind her like leaves in the wind. She barely looked at Sophia before heading to the living room. Nathan came in shortly after, warm as always, giving his mom a proper hug and complimenting the smell of the house. They sat down to eat. Conversation bounced lightly between Isabel's job and Nathan's latest apartment hunt. Elliot chimed in occasionally, mostly to insert sarcasm or critique. Sophia tried to stay present, soaking in the noise of family, the clinking of forks, the sound of laughter, even if none of it was aimed at her. Midway through the meal, Isabel reached for a muffin, took a bite, and said, "Ugh, Mom, these are so dry. Did you change the recipe?" Sophia felt the flush rise in her cheeks. "No," she said softly. "Same one as always." Isabel wrinkled her nose and put it down. "Maybe it's the altitude or something." Elliot chuckled. "She's always had a talent for making things complicated." He took a sip of coffee, then added, "Remember when she made that birthday cake for Nathan and forgot the sugar?" There was a beat of silence, then laughter, Nathan included. "I was 6, Dad." He said, "I thought she was trying to poison me." Elliot grinned. "Yeah, well, at least it looked good. She always puts in the effort. It's the execution that trips her up." The table erupted in more laughter. Sophia stared at her plate. She felt the burn behind her eyes, but she didn't cry. Not in front of them. Not in front of Elliot. She forced a smile, picked up her napkin, and dabbed at the corner of her mouth like something delicate and fragile might break if she moved too fast. Nathan, catching the change in her expression, shifted slightly in his chair. "The quiche is really good, Mom." He offered his voice, quiet but genuine. But the moment had passed. The humiliation had already taken root. Not loud or explosive, but sharp in its intimacy. This wasn't some stranger ridiculing her in public. This was her husband, her daughter, laughing at her in the house she had built with her bare hands over food she made with love. Sophia excused herself after dessert. No one stopped her. In the kitchen, she stood at the sink staring out the window while hot water ran over the plates. The same plates she had washed 1,000 times before. The same view of the backyard garden she attended alone for years. She heard their voices drifting in from the other room. Light content, unbothered. That was the moment something shifted in her. Not snapped. Sophia didn't break that way, but she felt something inside her settle, solidify like a door quietly closing in the back of her mind. They didn't see her. Not really. She wasn't a person in their lives anymore. She was a function, a role, a background presence they expected to keep smiling, keep cooking, keep absorbing the blows with grace. That night after everyone had left, Elliot patted her on the shoulder as he walked upstairs. "You did good today." He said they were happy. Sophia smiled faintly, nodded and waited until he disappeared down the hallway. Then she sat at the table in the dim kitchen light and wrote one sentence in her diary. "I think I'm done being the joke in my own story." Sophia didn't storm out. She didn't scream or slam doors. When she finally walked away, it was with the quiet resolve of someone who had already left 100 times in her heart. It had been 3 weeks since the brunch. The humiliation still lingered, replaying in her mind at night, while Elliot snored beside her, blissfully unaware. The weeks following the disastrous family brunch took on a surreal quality for Sophia. She moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, preparing meals, maintaining the house, participating in community activities. But something fundamental had changed inside her. A line had been crossed invisible to others, but unmistakable to her. She thought often of her mother in the final years of her life, how Margaret had grown increasingly silent. Her spirit diminished to a whisper before her body finally gave out. At the time, Sophia had attributed her mother's withdrawal to age and illness. But now she recognized something else. The exhaustion of being unseen for decades, of having her personhood gradually eroded by casual dismissals and thoughtless jokes. "I am not going to disappear like she did." Sophia whispered to herself one morning standing in front of the bathroom mirror. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. No fist raised in defiance, no voice raised in anger. Just a quiet promise to the woman reflected back at her. A woman who still had years ahead, who still had value beyond her usefulness. To others who deserved more than polite tolerance, from the people who claimed to love her, she began making practical preparations. Not with the urgency of escape, but with the deliberation of someone planning a necessary journey. She sorted through her belongings, mentally cataloging what was truly hers versus what belonged to the shared life she was considering leaving. She researched her financial situation quietly, consulting a financial advisor recommended by Vivian rather than the family accountant who reported everything to Elliot. She learned she had more resources than she'd realized, a small inheritance from her aunt that had grown modestly over the years. Her own retirement account from her teaching days. Several valuable pieces of jewelry from her mother that had been appraised but rarely worn. Not wealth, but enough for a fresh start if carefully managed. One afternoon, she drove to the lake cabin her aunt had left her years ago. It was modest, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a porch overlooking the water, and had been used primarily for weekend getaways when the children were young. In recent years, it had sat mostly vacant, visited, occasionally by Elliot for fishing trips with his friends, but otherwise forgotten. The place needed work. The roof leaked in one corner. The plumbing was temperamental. Wildlife had occasionally found their way inside during vacant winters, but the structure was sound. She walked through the dusty rooms, opening windows to air out the musty smell, envisioning possibilities. A studio space in the second bedroom, bookshelves along the living room wall, a garden plot behind the kitchen where the soil looked rich. As she stood on the porch watching sunlight dance across the lake's surface, Sophia felt something she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Not just for escape from her current situation, but for creation of something new. A life designed around her own rhythms and preferences, not contorted to accommodate others' expectations. She made a list of necessary repairs, took measurements for furniture she might need, photographed the interior to reference later. Practical tasks that grounded her emerging plan in reality, rather than wishful thinking. Back at home, she continued her quiet preparations. She renewed her driver's license with her own last name, not the hyphenated version she had used since marriage. She opened a separate bank account at a credit union across town, depositing modest amounts that wouldn't be noticed missing from their joint account. She began digitizing old family photos, making copies of important documents, sorting through decades of accumulated papers to identify what she might need. Elliot noticed none of this. He was increasingly absorbed in his own concerns, the business transition as he moved toward partial retirement, his golf game, his social engagements with other men, his age. Their interactions had diminished to brief exchanges about household logistics, occasional updates about the children, and silent coexistence during evening television viewing. One night, as they sat in the living room, Elliot scrolling through news on his tablet, Sophia pretending to read a novel while actually planning her departure, he made a rare personal comment. "Jim and Carol are getting divorced," he said without looking up. "After 38 years, can you believe it?" "What happened?" she asked, curious about his reaction more than the specific situation. Elliot shook his head. "Jim says they just grew apart. Carol claims he never really saw her. Typical stuff." He snorted softly. "Seems ridiculous to throw away 4 decades over feeling unappreciated. Everyone feels unappreciated sometimes. That's just life." The casual dismissal of emotional neglect as typical stuff reinforced Sophia's resolve. In Elliot's worldview, Carol's pain was trivial. Her need to be truly seen by her husband, an unreasonable expectation after decades together. His comment revealed volumes about how he conceptualized marriage as an arrangement that, once established, required little emotional maintenance, regardless of how one partner might be suffering. Maybe for Carol, being seen was essential, not optional, Sophia suggested quietly. Elliot glanced up, momentarily surprised by her response. Well, she'll be seen all right alone in an apartment at 65. Jim says she's moving to Arizona to find herself. The air quotes were audible in his tone. Seems a bit late for that. Sophia returned to her book, but his words echoed in her mind. Too late. The phrase carried weight, resonated with her own fears. Was it too late for her to reclaim herself? To build something meaningful from the remnants of dreams, deferred to find joy and purpose beyond the narrow confines of her current existence? That night she wrote in her journal, "Is 63 too late to begin again?" Society would say yes. Elliot would certainly say yes. But something in me, something that has survived decades of quiet erasure, insists otherwise. There is life yet to be lived, art yet to be created, joy yet to be experienced, if not now, when if not by my own choice, then how? The following week brought the final catalyst for Sophia's decision. It was ordinary Tuesday morning. Elliot came downstairs as she prepared breakfast, poured himself coffee, and sat at the table scrolling through emails on his phone. Sophia placed his usual breakfast before him, 2 eggs over medium wheat toast, sliced fruit, and sat opposite with her own tea and oatmeal. "I've been thinking," she began carefully, "about taking that art workshop in Maine this summer, the one I mentioned a few months ago. It's 2 weeks and 2 weeks. Elliot interrupted, not looking up from his phone. Who would handle the garden? And isn't that when the grandkids usually visit? Isabel could bring them another time. Sophia suggested, and the garden could manage without me for 2 weeks. It's important to me, Elliot. I've wanted to study with this particular teacher for years. He finally glanced up, his expression, a mixture of confusion and mild irritation. Why, it's not like you're going to become a professional artist at this point. Seems like an expensive hobby. The words weren't delivered with cruelty, just casual dismissal, as if her artistic pursuit was equivalent to a passing interest in crossword puzzles or bird watching, pleasant but ultimately inconsequential. As if the passion that had sustained her spirit through decades of compromise was merely a whim that could be indulged or denied depending on convenience. Sophia stared at him, truly seeing the man across from her, not the young hardware store owner who had fixed her leaky faucet, not the father of her children, not the provider who had ensured material comfort throughout their marriage, but the stranger he had become. A man who could look at her deepest longing and see nothing of value. "You're right," she said finally, her voice calm. "It is expensive, I shouldn't go." He nodded already, returning to his emails apparently satisfied that the matter was settled. He didn't notice the shift in her expression, the slight straightening of her spine, the quiet finality in her eyes. That evening, Sophia called the workshop organizer and secured her place with a credit card payment from her separate account. Then she contacted a contractor recommended by a friend to begin repairs on the lake cabin. Finally, she emailed Nathan asking if he could help her move some furniture in a few weeks, without specifying why. The decision wasn't impulsive, though the timing might appear so. It was the culmination of years of diminishment, of moments large and small, when she had been reduced from partner to background character in her own life. The workshop conversation had simply clarified what she had been gradually accepting. There was no path forward with Elliot that included her wholeness. For years she had subsisted on crumbs of connection, convinced herself that stability compensated for emotional neglect, told herself that her discontent was selfish or ungrateful. But watching Elliot dismiss her art, the expression of her truest self, with such casual indifference, crystallized the reality she had been avoiding. He would never see her completely again, and she could no longer bear being invisible in her own home. As she prepared for bed that night, moving through familiar routines in the bathroom they shared, she studied Elliot as he flossed his teeth. The methodical back and forth motion, the slight frown of concentration, the absolute self-absorption in this simple task, all emblematic of how he moved through life, focused entirely on his own experience, while barely registering hers. "Elliot," she said suddenly, "are you happy with our marriage?" He blinked, startled by the directness of the question. "Happy enough?" he replied after a moment. "Why, are you planning some kind of second honeymoon or something?" His tone was lightly teasing, as if the idea of rekindling romance was slightly absurd at their age. "No," Sophia said softly. "I just wondered if you ever think about what we've become to each other." He rinsed his mouth, wiped his face with a towel, and turned to her with a puzzled expression. "We've been married 40 years, Sophia. We raised 2 successful kids. We have a comfortable life. What more is there to think about?" His response contained no malice, no intentional cruelty, just genuine incomprehension that she might be asking about emotional connection rather than practical accomplishment. It confirmed what she already knew. They were speaking different languages across an unbridgeable divide. "Nothing," she said finally. "There's nothing more to think about." In bed, she lay awake long after Elliot's breathing had settled into the familiar rhythm of sleep. She watched moonlight create patterns on the ceiling, thought about the woman she had been at 22, hopeful, creative, certain that love would provide room for her dreams alongside his. She thought about the years of small surrenders, of gradually accommodating herself to ever-narrowing expectations. And she thought about the future, not distant and abstract, but immediate and possible. A small cabin by the lake, mornings spent painting, as sunlight sparkled on water. Evenings with books she had always meant to read. Friendships based on genuine interest rather than social obligation. Space to breathe, to create, to remember who she was beneath the layers of roles she had inhabited. It wouldn't be perfect. It might often be lonely. There would be practical challenges and moments of doubt, but it would be hers, a life chosen rather than endured, shaped by her own desires rather than modified to fit others' convenience. She turned away from Elliot's sleeping form and closed her eyes, not in surrender but in resolution. The path forward had clarified, not in dramatic revelation, but in quiet certainty. She would leave this marriage not with bitterness or recrimination, but with the dignity of someone who had finally recognized her own worth. The when and how remained to be determined, but the decision itself was made. Not in haste, not in anger, but in the clear-eyed acceptance that some distances cannot be crossed, some patterns cannot be broken, some relationships cannot be salvaged without the sacrifice of one's essential self. And she was no longer willing to be that sacrifice. She no longer bothered to cook much. Meals were simpler. Eggs, toast, soup from a can. Elliot didn't comment. He barely noticed. He spent more time out of the house now, golfing or meeting the guys for dinner. Sophia stopped asking where he was going or when he'd be back. The answers no longer mattered, but the silence between them had changed. Before it was filled with hope. Now it was heavy, final one. Tuesday morning. Sophia stood in front of her closet holding a dress she hadn't worn in years. It was deep green, elegant but modest, and it reminded her of who she used to be. Someone who liked to dress up, who felt seen. She tried it on and stared at her reflection. It still fit. She didn't cry, but she did take a deep breath, the kind you take when you've made a decision that can't be undone. She placed the dress carefully on the bed, then pulled her suitcase from the back of the closet, the same one she had used to visit her sister in Oregon years ago. It still smelled faintly of lavender. She laid it open and began folding clothes, not with panic, not with urgency, but with intention. Comfortable shoes, her favorite sweater, a few books, a framed photo of Nathan and Isabel when they were small. She packed the essentials and then a few things just for her. Things she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. Her diary sat on the nightstand. She stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up and tucked it into her handbag. Elliot came home mid-afternoon. She was standing at the kitchen counter holding a cup of tea. He gave her a glance, then walked past her toward the den. "Did you pick up the dry cleaning?" he asked. She didn't answer. He turned irritated. "Sophia." She looked at him, really looked. At the man who once held her hand in the hospital when Nathan was born. The man who built her a bookshelf for her birthday, the first year they were married. The man who had, piece by piece, unraveled her without ever realizing what he was doing. "I'm leaving," she said. Elliot blinked. "What?" She gestured toward the suitcase by the stairs. "I'm going to stay with Vivian for a while." "For what?" His voice was more confused than angry. "What's going on?" Sophia's voice didn't shake. "I need to remember who I am, because this, whatever we've become, it's not living." He laughed bitterly. "So now you're the victim!" "No," she replied calmly. "Not anymore." Elliot stared at her like she'd just grown wings. She could see him calculating the inconvenience, the embarrassment. But not once did he ask her to stay. Not once did he say her name with warmth. Not once did he look sorry. And that told her everything. She left without ceremony. No farewell toasts, no packed lunches, no folded goodbye notes. Just a woman walking out of a house she had once dreamed in, now suffocated in. Vivian met her at the door with open arms. Her friend didn't ask questions, didn't say, "I told you so." She simply opened the guest room and said, "This is yours for as long as you need." That first night, Sophia sat on the small twin bed, her suitcase still zipped. The room was quiet, too quiet. For the first time in years, no one asked her what was for dinner. No one tossed their laundry near her feet. No one made her feel like a burden in her own home. And yet her chest ached not from regret, but from release. She opened her diary and wrote, "I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm not broken. I'm just tired of being invisible. And today I chose to be seen if only by myself." Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, as if the world itself whispered, "Finally." Sophia hadn't expected the quiet to feel so sharp. The first few days at Vivian's passed in a blur. The guest room was clean and cozy. A twin bed, a nightstand, with a ceramic lamp, a window that let in the afternoon sun. The day after Sophia left, Elliot called twice, leaving brief messages that sounded more annoyed than concerned. "You could have at least left a note about where the homeowner's insurance documents are." And later, "The Andersons invited us to dinner Saturday. Should I tell them you're finding yourself or something?" She didn't return the calls. The casual assumption that she would continue managing his life from a distance, that her departure was a temporary tantrum rather than a fundamental break, confirmed she had made the right decision. His messages didn't acknowledge her pain or express any desire for reconciliation. They simply highlighted the inconvenience her absence created in his orderly life. Vivian's home became a sanctuary, where Sophia gradually began reassembling the scattered pieces of her identity. The guest room transformed into a temporary haven, her watercolors arranged on the desk book stacked on the nightstand, a vase of fresh flowers that she replaced weekly, small assertions of personhood, preferences expressed without apology or explanation. You know. Vivian commented one evening as they shared a bottle of wine on the back porch. "You laugh more now. Even when you're sad, there's something lighter about you." Sophia considered this. "I think I'd forgotten how exhausting it is to constantly adjust yourself to someone else's indifference, to keep hoping for recognition that never comes. Hope can be the cruelest addiction." Vivian agreed, refilling their glasses. "Especially when it's attached to someone who has no intention of changing." Sophia called her children a week after leaving, wanting to explain her decision directly, rather than letting them hear distorted versions from Elliot. Nathan answered immediately, concern evident in his voice. "Dad said you're staying with Vivian. Are you okay? Did something happen?" "I'm fine," she assured him. "Nothing dramatic happened. That's part of the problem. 40 years of nothing dramatic happening. Just slow erosion until there was nothing left." The line was silent for a moment. "I think I understand," Nathan finally said. "I've watched how he treats you, how he talks to you, or doesn't. I just thought, I don't know. I thought that was just how marriage worked after so long." "That's what I thought too," Sophia admitted, "until I couldn't anymore." "Are you coming back? Is this temporary?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications about family stability, holiday gatherings, the comfortable narrative they had all accepted about their perfect family. Sophia took a breath before answering. "I don't think so, Nathan. I need to build something different now while I still can." His support was immediate and uncomplicated. "Then do it, Mom. Whatever you need, I'm with you." Isabel's reaction was more complex. When Sophia called her daughter, sounded distracted, then defensive, when she realized the purpose of the conversation. "You can't just leave," she insisted. "What about Dad? What about holidays? What about your grandchildren? Have you thought about anyone besides yourself?" The accusation stung, but Sophia recognized it for what it was: fear of change, of disruption to the family order. Perhaps even fear that her mother's choices might force her to examine her own life more critically. "I've spent 40 years thinking about everyone but myself," Sophia replied, keeping her voice gentle but firm. "I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm just creating space where I can exist as more than someone's wife or mother or grandmother." "This is so selfish," Isabel persisted. "At your age, starting over. What's even the point? The point is that I'm still alive," Sophia said simply, "and I want to feel that way for whatever time I have left." The conversation ended without resolution, Isabel clearly upset and Elliot's influence evident in her perspective. But Sophia felt a strange peace afterward. She had spoken her truth without anger or justification, without seeking approval or understanding. It was enough to have voiced it regardless of how it was received. In the days that followed, Sophia began practical preparations for longer-term independence. She consulted an attorney recommended by Vivian, learning about her rights in a separation after such a long marriage. She spoke with her doctor about transferring medical records and prescriptions. She contacted the bank to understand her access to joint accounts and credit cards. None of these steps indicated immediate divorce. She wasn't ready for such finality, and part of her wondered if Elliot might eventually recognize what had been lost and seek genuine reconciliation. But she was preparing for a future that didn't depend on his awakening or approval. A future she could navigate with dignity regardless of his choices. 2 weeks after she left, Elliot requested a meeting. They arranged to talk at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown that neither frequented regularly. Sophia arrived early, selecting a corner table that offered some privacy. She wore the green dress she had rediscovered the day she packed her suitcase, a small assertion of her emerging selfhood. When Elliot entered, she was struck by how ordinary he appeared. The same navy sweater he'd worn for years, the same carefully combed hair, the same slight frown of concentration as he scanned the room for her. The man who had dominated her existence for 4 decades now seemed smaller, somehow less imposing, just another older gentleman in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. He sat across from her without embracing or even touching her hand. His expression was guarded, his posture stiff. "You've made your point." He began as if they were continuing a conversation already in progress. "I think it's time you came home now. Whatever this is, it's disruptive. People are asking questions." Sophia studied him, looking for any sign that he understood why she had left, that her absence had prompted reflection or insight. She saw only annoyance and confusion, the response of someone inconvenienced rather than someone confronting loss. "What questions are they asking?" she inquired softly. "Where you are, why you left, what's wrong?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Pastor Jim called to check if we needed counseling." "And do we," she asked, "need counseling?" Elliot sighed heavily. "Sophia, we've been married 40 years. Every marriage has rough patches. But you don't just walk out because you're feeling unappreciated or whatever this is about. It's not a rough patch," she said, her voice steady. "It's a life I can no longer live, a silence I can no longer bear, an invisibility I can no longer accept." He stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language, his expression a mixture of impatience and bewilderment. "What are you talking about? You have everything you need. We have a good life." "You have a good life," she corrected gently. "I have a non-existence." "That's dramatic. Don't you think you volunteer? You have your little art group. You have friends. What more do you want?" The question was genuine. He truly couldn't comprehend what was missing. Why the comfortable arrangement they had maintained for decades was suddenly insufficient for her. In that moment, Sophia realized the true extent of the gap between them. It wasn't just that he didn't see her. He didn't understand that being seen mattered. "I want to be known, Elliot," she said finally. "Not just tolerated or accommodated, known, valued for who I am. Not just what I provide. And that hasn't been possible between us for a very long time. So you're punishing me for not being a mind reader." His voice held an edge of irritation now. "For not constantly reassuring you or whatever it is you need." "No." Sophia shook her head. "I'm not punishing you at all. I'm choosing myself. There's a difference." They talked for nearly an hour, moving in circles that never quite connected. Elliot veered between dismissing her concerns as menopausal melodrama and acknowledging that perhaps he had taken her for granted a bit. A concession that fell far short of understanding the depth of her disillusionment. When they finally parted, Sophia felt both sadness and certainty. The man she had shared her life with for 4 decades remained a stranger to her deepest self, not through malice but through a fundamental inability to see beyond his own experience. Whether this limitation was personal to Elliot or endemic to men of his generation was irrelevant. The result was the same. She walked back to Vivian's house, slowly processing the encounter Elliot hadn't asked her to return because he missed her presence or recognized her value. He had asked her to return because her absence disrupted his routine and created social awkwardness. His concern was for restoration of normalcy, not repair of relationship. That evening she sat at the small desk in Vivian's guest room and wrote in her journal, "Today I saw clearly what I've suspected for years. Elliot cannot give what he does not possess. He cannot offer recognition. He doesn't understand connection. He doesn't feel or insight he hasn't developed. This isn't about blame, it's about acceptance. We have reached the natural conclusion of what we can be to each other." The words felt like both an ending and a beginning, the final acknowledgement of what could not be changed, and the first declaration of what might still be possible. Not with Elliot, but within herself. Not in the life they had built together, but in whatever life she might yet create from the raw materials of her remaining years. She slept deeply that night without the restless anxiety that had characterized her sleep for so long. In the morning, she woke with unexpected clarity about her next steps. It was time to visit the lake cabin again, this time not just to assess its condition, but to begin transforming it into a home, her home designed, according to her preferences, filled with objects that reflected her taste and interests, a physical manifestation of her emerging independence. The contractor had already begun basic repairs, fixing the leaky roof, addressing plumbing issues, replacing broken windows. Now Sophia needed to consider more personal touches, paint colors for the walls, furniture arrangements, garden plans, choices made not in compromise or consultation, but in reflection of her own desires. She spent that afternoon creating a vision board, cutting images from magazines, sketching layout ideas, listing plants for the garden. The process was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. After decades of considering others' needs and preferences in every decision, the freedom to choose based solely on her own taste felt almost transgressive. But with each image, she selected each color. She considered each plan. She formulated something long dormant, awakened within her. Not just creativity, but agency. The power to shape her environment according to her vision, rather than adapting herself to fit existing circumstances. When Vivian returned from the bookshop that evening, Sophia shared her plans with uncharacteristic animation. "I'm thinking of painting the main room, this soft yellow," she explained, pointing to a color swatch, "and maybe building bookshelves along this wall, and the bedroom. I'm thinking of lavender, not too bright, just a hint of color." Vivian listened, smiling at her friend's enthusiasm. "It sounds perfect," she said when Sophia finally paused for breath. "When do you start?" "Next week," Sophia replied without hesitation. "I've already ordered some furniture, nothing fancy, just pieces that feel like me." "And what about Elliot, the house? All your things there?" The questions were practical, not challenging. Vivian understood better than most the complexity of disentangling a life built over decades, one step at a time. Sophia said thoughtfully, "I need to establish my own space first. Then I can figure out what from the old life still belongs in the new one." That night she emailed Nathan sharing her plans for the cabin, and asking if he might visit when the initial renovations were complete. His response came quickly. "I'm proud of you, Mom. Can't wait to see your new place. Need help with anything?" The simple acceptance in his message brought tears to her eyes. No judgment, no pressure to reconcile, just support for her choices and an offer of assistance. It was more than she had dared hope for in the early days of her separation. Isabel remained distant, her rare messages terse and focused on practical matters. When she would bring the children to visit their grandfather, whether holiday plans would change questions about family heirlooms that suddenly seemed urgent now that the family structure was shifting. Sophia responded with patience, never pushing for emotional connection, understanding that her daughter needed time to adjust to this new reality. Isabel had always identified more strongly with Elliot seeing in his practical approach to life a model for her own ambitious career path. Her mother's sudden assertion of independence challenged not just family stability, but Isabel's own narrative about relationships and compromise. As preparations for the cabin renovations accelerated, Sophia realized she needed to return to the house on Maple Street to collect personal items, clothing for the changing seasons, art supplies, books she couldn't easily replace. She arranged a time when Elliot would be at his weekly golf game, hoping to avoid another difficult conversation. Vivian offered to accompany her, but Sophia declined. "This is something I need to do alone," she explained, to say goodbye to that space, at least as it was. When she arrived at the house, it felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, the same structure that had contained her life for decades, but now viewed through the lens of her emerging independence. She noticed things she had overlooked before, how the decor reflected primarily Elliot's preferences, how the arrangement of furniture facilitated his routines, how even the photographs displayed featured moments that centered around his accomplishments and interests. She moved through the rooms, efficiently gathering items that felt essential to her new beginning art supplies, favorite books, clothing that expressed her rediscovered style, rather than blending into the background of family life. She took few decorative objects, leaving behind the china sets and silver service that had been used for entertaining Elliot's business associates, the formal living room furnishings selected to project stability and success. What she did take were personal treasures, the small clay sculpture Nathan had made in 3rd grade, a watercolor she had painted during a rare weekend workshop. Years ago, a quilt her grandmother had stitched by hand. Objects that connected her not to the role she had played in the Harrington household, but to her authentic self and heritage. In the master bathroom, she hesitated before the medicine cabinet, studying the woman reflected in the mirror. Not young anymore, certainly with silver threading through her hair and fine lines mapping her experiences across her face. But not finished either. Not diminished, just changed like a landscape, altered by seasons but still vibrant with possibility. "There you are," she whispered to her reflection, recognizing in her own eyes a clarity that had been absent for too long. Not happiness. Exactly the process of dismantling a life held too much grief for simple happiness, but purpose, direction. The quiet certainty of someone who had finally acknowledged her own worth. As she descended the stairs with her final load of belongings, she heard the front door open. Elliot stood in the entryway, golf clubs slung over his shoulder, surprise evident in his expression. "I thought you'd be gone by now," she said, her voice steady despite the unexpected encounter. "Game was cancelled weather," he replied shortly, his eyes tracking the suitcases and boxes near the door. "So you're really doing this moving to the cabin?" She nodded. "It's time, Elliot, for both of us." He set his golf clubs down, a gesture that seemed both resigned and defeated. "Do you need help with those?" he asked, indicating her luggage. The offer, practical, rather than emotional, was so characteristically Elliot that Sophia almost smiled. Even now, facing the dissolution of their marriage, his response was to manage logistics rather than address feelings. "Thank you," she said simply. "That would be kind." They loaded her car in silence, the familiar choreography of long partnership guiding their movements, despite the changed circumstances. When the last box was secure, they stood awkwardly in the driveway, 40 years of shared history between them, yet suddenly strangers to each other's interior landscapes. "I'll need to discuss finances," Elliot said finally. "The house, the accounts, I've spoken to Bill Davidson about handling things." Sophia nodded. The attorney he mentioned was a golfing buddy, someone who had managed their estate planning for years. "I have representation as well," she replied. "They can coordinate." His eyebrows rose, slightly surprised. Perhaps that she had taken such independent action, or maybe just recognition that the woman standing before him was not the compliant wife he had taken for granted. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice low. "I thought we were fine." "I know," Sophia answered gently. "That's the problem, Elliot. You thought we were fine because you never had to consider whether I was fine, whether I was fulfilled or valued, or even seen." He shook his head, confusion evident in his expression. "I don't understand what you wanted from me. What was missing that was so terrible? You had to blow up our entire life." The question wasn't hostile. He genuinely couldn't comprehend her discontent, the slow suffocation of spirit she had experienced within their marriage. And in that moment, Sophia realized that no explanation she could offer would bridge the fundamental disconnect between them. "It wasn't terrible," she said finally. "It just wasn't enough. Not anymore. Maybe not for a long time." She got into her car, then closing the door on further discussion. In the rearview mirror as she drove away, she could see Elliot still standing in the driveway, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the house they had shared. He looked smaller, somehow, diminished not by her departure but by his own inability to understand why it had become necessary. The road ahead curved toward the lake, toward the cabin that was becoming her sanctuary, toward a future unwritten by expectation or obligation. A future shaped by her own hand according to her own vision. Uncertain, yes, sometimes frightening in its openness. But hers, finally, unequivocally hers. Vivian had tried to make it feel like home, placing fresh flowers on the dresser and laying out fluffy towels in the hall bathroom. But nothing about it felt like Sophia's life. It felt like she had stepped into someone else's calm, someone else's rhythm. Each morning, Sophia woke up to the sound of birds outside the window and wondered for a split second if it had all been a dream. But then she'd turn over and see her suitcase still on the floor, her slippers tucked neatly beside it, and she would remember she'd left. She'd walked away from her home, from the man who didn't love her anymore, from 4 decades of quiet disappointment. And now, what? She didn't cry right away. At first, there was just numbness. She went through the motions, helped Vivian with meals, made small talk over tea, even accompanied her to the grocery store. But inside, Sophia felt like a hollow version of herself, like she was wearing her own skin loosely. There was no relief, only disorientation. She didn't know what to do with herself when she wasn't being useful to someone else. On the 4th night, she wandered into the kitchen after Vivian had gone to bed. The clock above the sink ticked softly. She stood there in the dim light, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, staring at the wall without seeing it. She felt a weight pressing down on her chest. Not panic, not fear something. Heavier. Emptiness. She opened the fridge not because she was hungry, but because she needed to do something. She stared at the rows of neatly stacked containers and closed it again. Her fingers trembled. She walked to the pantry, then the window, then back to the counter. Finally, she sank down to the kitchen floor, curled her knees to her chest, and buried her face in her hands. She didn't sob. It was quieter than that, more surrender than anguish. She thought about all the things she had done right, all the birthdays remembered, the shirts ironed, the gentle advice, the unconditional patience. And she thought about how none of it had been enough. She had given the best of herself to people who had come to expect it, like clockwork, like background music, not maliciously, just carelessly. She wasn't needed, not really. Even Isabel hadn't called since the brunch. Nathan had texted once, "Hey, Mom, hope you're okay. Love you." And while it was kind, it felt more like obligation than connection. She didn't blame them. They had their own lives. But the loneliness of being forgotten by the very people she built her life around, that was the hardest part. Sophia stayed on the floor for over an hour. When her legs finally ached from the cold tile, she stood up slowly, gripping the counter for balance. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it in silence, as if trying to fill the space inside her with something. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Around 3:00 a.m., she got up and opened her suitcase. She pulled out her journal and sat at the desk by the window. The moonlight streamed in cool and silver. She opened to a blank page and wrote, "I feel invisible, not to others, to myself. I don't know who I am when I'm not being useful. I don't know how to be loved without earning it." Tears finally came, but they weren't loud. They rolled down her cheeks quietly, like a tide pulling back, exposing everything that had been buried so bottom. Sophia realized wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looked like a tidy guest room. A cup of cold tea and a woman who had forgotten how to take up space in her own life. But beneath the grief, something stirred. Not strength, not yet, just awareness. She wasn't okay, not even close. But for the first time in years, she had said it out loud. And in the stillness that followed, there was a strange kind of comfort. The days immediately following Sophia's breakdown on Vivian's kitchen floor passed in a fog of grief and disorientation. She moved through them mechanically, performing basic functions, eating when food was placed before her, responding when questions were asked, maintaining minimal personal hygiene, but without any real engagement with the world around her. Vivian watched with concern but didn't push, sensing that her friend was navigating a necessary passage through darkness. She provided quiet companionship, placing cups of tea at Sophia's elbow, suggesting gentle activities like short walks or simple cooking projects, but never demanding conversation or explanation. Grief doesn't follow a timetable. Vivian told her one evening when Sophia apologized for being poor company, "You're mourning 40 years of life that doesn't disappear overnight." A week into her stay, Sophia received a package from Nathan, a sketchbook bound in soft leather, high-quality drawing pencils, and a note that read simply, "For when you're ready to see the world again, love you, Mom." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought fresh tears, but these felt different, cleansing rather than depleting, a release of something long held rather than an expression of immediate pain. She ran her fingers over the blank pages, thinking of all they might eventually contain. That same day, she forced herself to walk to the end of Vivian Street, and back the first independent action she had taken since arriving. The autumn air held a crisp edge, leaves crunching beneath her feet, birds calling from trees, ablaze with color. She moved slowly, her body remembering rhythms it had nearly forgotten. At the corner, she paused to watch children playing in a nearby yard, their laughter carrying on the wind. A small boy, perhaps 4 years old, was attempting to jump into a pile of leaves his older sister had carefully gathered. Each time he leapt, she shrieked in mock outrage, then helped him rebuild the pile for another attempt. Sophia found herself smiling at their innocent joy, their complete absorption in the moment. When was the last time she had felt that kind of unself-conscious pleasure? That freedom from worry about others' judgments or needs? She couldn't remember. Back at Vivian's, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the afternoon light change the shadows on the lawn. For the first time since leaving her marriage, her mind wasn't crowded with questions about the past or anxieties about the future. She simply observed the present moment, the play of sunlight through leaves, the distant sound of a neighbor's wind chimes, the warmth of ceramic against her palms. That evening she opened the sketchbook Nathan had sent. Her first strokes were hesitant, uncertain, simple studies of objects on Vivian's coffee table. A lamp, a vase of dried flowers, the pattern of light through window blinds. But as her hand remembered its purpose, the lines became more confident, the observations more precise. She lost track of time, absorbed in the act of seeing and recording, translating three-dimensional reality into two-dimensional representation. When she finally looked up, hours had passed, and Vivian was smiling at her from the doorway. "Welcome back," her friend said softly. Sophia looked down at the pages filled with drawings, not masterpieces, but honest attempts to engage with the visual world. "I'm not sure I'm back yet," she admitted, "but maybe I'm on my way." That night she wrote in her journal with greater clarity than she had managed since leaving Elliot. "Today I remembered what it feels like to be present, not for someone else but for myself, to see without judgment, to create without expectation. It's a small thing, but it feels like the beginning of something, like waking up after a long, dreamless sleep." The following morning she asked to borrow Vivian's car. "I need to see the cabin," she explained, "to remind myself where I'm heading." Vivian handed over the keys without question. "Take all the time you need, and Sophia, take your sketchbook." The drive to the lake took nearly an hour, winding through countryside ablaze with autumn color. Sophia drove with windows partly open, letting fresh air clear her senses. The cabin, when she arrived, looked much as she remembered, slightly neglected but structurally sound, nestled among tall pines, with a view of the water through the trees. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight from the single window. The air smelled of disuse and pine, not unpleasant, but clearly uninhabited. She moved slowly through the small rooms, touching surfaces, opening cupboards, assessing conditions with new purpose. This space, for all its current shabbiness, represented possibility. No layer of memories to navigate, no compromises embedded in every choice, no ghost of disregarded preferences haunting each corner. Just empty rooms waiting to be filled, according to her vision alone. She sat on the sagging porch steps, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw, not the cabin as it was, but as it could be. A comfortable reading chair by the window, bookshelves lining one wall, a small table for meals with a view of the lake, a studio space where northern light would illuminate her canvas. As she drew, something shifted in her perspective. She was no longer just leaving a failed marriage. She was moving toward a new life, not just escaping silence, but creating harmony. Not just fleeing invisibility, but claiming presence. The distinction was subtle but profound, from reaction to action, from victim to creator. From defining herself by what she had lost to envisioning what she might yet build. When she finally closed her sketchbook and prepared to leave, Sophia felt an unfamiliar sensation stirring beneath her grief. Not quite excitement, but anticipation. The future stretched before her, unwritten and undefined, terrifying in its openness, but also alluring in its possibility. Back at Vivian's, she spread her sketches across the kitchen table and began making lists. Repairs needed furniture, required supplies to gather practical steps toward transforming vision into reality. "You seem different," Vivian observed, examining the drawings, more focused. "I think I am," Sophia replied. "I've been so busy grieving what I've lost that I couldn't see what might be possible. But today at the cabin, I could almost feel it. A life shaped by my own choices, organized around my own rhythms. It's terrifying, Vivian, but it's also, I don't know, freeing." That night she called Nathan to thank him for the sketchbook and share her emerging plans for the cabin. His enthusiasm buoyed her spirit further. "I could help with some of the renovations," he offered. "Maybe come for a weekend when you're ready to start work." The simple offer of practical support meant more than elaborate expressions of sympathy would have. It acknowledged her choice as valid, her new direction as worthy of investment. It treated her as capable, rather than fragile, as moving forward, rather than merely recovering. When she hung up, Sophia stood at Vivian's kitchen window, watching darkness settle over the neighborhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, financial discussions with her attorney, decisions about the house on Maple Street, ongoing navigation of Isabel's disappointment. The road ahead remained difficult, uncertain, but tonight, for the first time since walking out of her marriage, she felt the faintest flicker of what might eventually become joy. Not happiness, based on external circumstances, but joy rooted in the simple truth that she was still alive, still capable of growth, still able to create meaning from whatever remained of her years. It was a small light barely visible in the landscape of her grief, but it was real, and it was hers. It was a rainy afternoon when Sophia stumbled across the box. She had been tidying Vivian's spare room out of habit, folding blankets that didn't need folding, realigning books on the shelf, rearranging drawers that were already organized. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about control, reclaiming something, however small, in a life that now felt completely untethered. As she slid the nightstand to sweep behind it, she noticed her handbag had tipped over. Its contents spilled slightly, including the small leather pouch that held some jewelry, a photo of her kids when they were little, and a folded sheet of paper she didn't recognize. No, not paper. A page from her old journal. It had torn away some time before she left. One of the older entries creased and smudged near the fold. The date at the top read, October 7th, 1993, nearly 30 years ago. Sophia sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, fingers tracing the faded ink. She remembered that fall. Isabel had just started middle school. Nathan had broken his arm on the playground. Elliot was working late nights, opening a second hardware store. She began reading, "I think Elliot still loves me, but I miss being looked at. I don't mean physically, though. Sometimes that too, I mean looked at like someone whose thoughts matter, whose feelings have weight. Today I told him I was overwhelmed and he said, "You worry too much. I want to feel held, not managed." Sophia blinked hard. She hadn't remembered writing those words, but they felt startlingly current, like her past self had reached forward through time to remind her this didn't just start. It had been simmering for decades. She rifled through her bag for her full journal. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, she flipped back through. Years of entries, some angry, others wistful, most just deeply honest. They told the story not of a crumbling marriage, but of a woman slowly disappearing inside of it. There were entries from joyful days, too. Christmas mornings, Nathan's graduation quiet evenings, when Elliot rubbed her feet without being asked. Sophia read those too, holding them like artifacts of something once beautiful. She didn't want to rewrite history. Their love had been real, but it had also withered under the weight of routine and resentment. One entry from 2007 caught her attention. He bought me lilies for our anniversary today, but when I told him they reminded me of funerals, he shrugged and said, "They were on sale." I smiled and said, "Thank you. Why do I keep shrinking to make room for his convenience?" She remembered that moment vividly now, not because of the flowers, but because that was the night she went to bed with a migraine and cried silently into her pillow, convinced she was ungrateful. Now she saw it for what it was, another inch lost in the slow erosion of her worth. And then tucked into the back sleeve of the journal, she found something unexpected, a photo faded and sun-washed. It was of her and Elliot, young and laughing, standing on the porch of their first home. His arm was slung around her shoulders. She was mid-laugh, eyes closed, mouth open, wide in joy. She hadn't remembered that version of herself, full of light, unguarded Sophia, stared at that photo for a long time. It struck her deeply and suddenly that she hadn't seen herself laugh like that in years. Not a polite smile, not a chuckle for company, a full, genuine laugh. The realization stung, but it also did something else. It sparked something. The pain didn't disappear, but beneath it, a question emerged, quiet but insistent. If that version of me once existed, could she still? That evening, Sophia didn't cook or clean or make tea. She sat by the window photo in hand, rain tapping softly against the glass. Her journal lay open in her lap. She didn't write a new entry. Not yet. For once she just sat with the truth, let it breathe, let herself feel it without trying to fix it. And in that stillness, surrounded by years of her own quiet voice, she didn't feel lost. She felt seen, not by Elliot, not even by Vivian, but by herself. And that was the beginning. Sophia's awakening didn't come as a dramatic moment. The discovery of her old journal entries catalyzed a subtle but profound shift in Sophia's perspective. She began seeing her departure not as a desperate escape from an intolerable situation, but as an intentional reclamation of her essential self, a self that had been gradually buried beneath decades of accommodation and compromise. This reframing had transformed her grief from a paralyzing weight into a necessary passage. She still mourned the marriage she had believed in, the partnership that never fully materialized the years spent trying to be seen by someone incapable of truly seeing her. But alongside that, grief grew a tentative excitement about the person she might yet become, or rather, rediscover. She began by organizing her days around her own natural rhythms rather than external expectations. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to sleep until she naturally woke to eat when hungry, rather than at prescribed mealtimes to rest when tired instead of pushing through exhaustion to complete arbitrary tasks. These small acts of self-determination might have seemed insignificant to an outside observer, but to Sophia, they represented radical departures from a lifetime of arranging her existence around others' needs and schedules. Each choice made solely according to her own preferences was both terrifying and exhilarating. A reclamation of agency long surrendered, she resumed drawing daily sometimes, spending hours lost in the process of observation and representation. She sketched Vivian's garden from different angles, capturing the architectural details of neighboring houses, studying her own hands as they aged, yet remained capable. The act of seeing truly, seeing the world around her, became a metaphor for her emerging self-awareness. One morning she found herself at the bathroom mirror, really looking at the woman reflected there, not with criticism or disappointment, but with genuine curiosity. Who was she now, beneath the role she had played for so long? What desires and capacities had survived the long drought of her marriage? What might still grow if properly nurtured? She studied the silver threading through her once auburn hair, the lines etched around her eyes and mouth, the slight softening of her jawline. Not with dismay at aging's inevitable progress, but with appreciation for the history, written on her features, evidence of a life fully experienced, if not always fully expressed. That afternoon, she called a hairstylist recommended by Vivian and made an appointment. Not for a trim or touch-up of her usual conservative style, but for something entirely new. When she returned from the salon hours later, she barely recognized herself. Her hair was shorter, more textured with subtle highlights that enhanced rather than concealed the silver strands. "Look at you!" Vivian exclaimed when she walked through the door. "You look awake." Sophia laughed a genuine laugh that surprised her with its fullness. "I feel awake, like I'm finally seeing myself clearly after a very long sleep." The external change reflected an internal transformation that was gathering momentum. She began purging remnants of her former self, donating clothes she had kept only because Elliot preferred them, discarding makeup that had never felt quite right on her face, releasing jewelry that symbolized obligations rather than joy. In their place, she began collecting objects that resonated with her emerging identity, comfortable clothing in colors she loved, art supplies that challenged and inspired her books she had always meant to read but never found time for. Not acquisitions made to impress others or fulfill social expectations, but thoughtful choices that expressed her reclaimed personhood. She spent an entire day at a nearby art museum, wandering through galleries at her own pace, lingering before paintings that moved her, skipping exhibits that didn't interest her. No compromise, no checking watches, no calculation of others' patience or preferences, just pure engagement with beauty, according to her own aesthetic response. In the museum cafe, she ordered a glass of wine with lunch, something she rarely did when married to Elliot, who disapproved of daytime drinking as impractical and slightly improper. The small rebellion felt deliciously indulgent, not the alcohol itself, but the freedom to choose without justification or apology. As she sipped her wine and watched visitors drift through the courtyard, a man about her age nodded politely from a nearby table. She returned the gesture without anxiety or expectation, simply acknowledging another human being sharing the same moment in time. He didn't approach, and she felt no disappointment, the interaction complete in its simplicity, requiring nothing more. That brief exchange represented another milestone in her awakening. For most of her adult life, Her value had been defined relationally as wife, mother, grandmother, volunteer, helper. Now she was learning to exist as herself, complete and valid without reference to her usefulness to others. She thought often of the photo she had found, that younger version of herself, laughing openly, without self-consciousness or restraint. What had happened to that woman? She hadn't died exactly, but had gone underground, retreating deeper with each dismissal, each casual devaluation, each moment of being overlooked or taken for granted. Now Sophia was excavating her, not through desperate resurrection of youth, but through patient rediscovery of essential qualities that transcended age: curiosity, creativity, authenticity, courage, qualities that had been present all along, but submerged beneath the weight of others' expectations and her own adaptive self-silencing. She began journaling differently now, not documenting grievances or cataloging disappointments, but exploring possibilities, recording observations, celebrating small victories in her journey towards selfhood. Her entries became less retrospective and more immediate, focused on the present moment rather than past hurts. Today I spent an hour watching a heron fish in the creek behind Vivian's house. She wrote one evening, so patient, so completely present, so attuned to subtle movements beneath the water surface. I want to cultivate that kind of attention, not just in my art but in my life, to notice everything, to be fully here. As her confidence grew, she began exploring beyond Vivian's neighborhood. She drove to nearby towns, wandering their main streets, entering shops that caught her interest, engaging in brief conversations with strangers. Each excursion expanded her sense of possibility, her awareness that the world remained full of discoveries. Despite her age, despite her personal losses, during one such exploration she discovered a small art supply store tucked between a bakery and a bookshop. The owner, a woman with wild gray hair and paint-stained hands, greeted her warmly and spent nearly an hour discussing different watercolor techniques. When Sophia mentioned her renewed interest in painting, "You should join our Tuesday night workshop," the woman suggested. Just a small group of us playing with different media. No pressure, no critiques, unless you want them. Just the joy of making things. Sophia hesitated, old insecurities surfacing. "I'm very rusty. It's been years since I painted seriously." The woman smiled. "That's the best time to start again, when you have nothing to prove and everything to discover." The simple wisdom in those words resonated deeply. Sophia signed up for the workshop before leaving the store, surprising herself with her spontaneity. When she told Vivian about it that evening, her friend raised an eyebrow. "You're blooming Sophia Harrington. It's remarkable to watch." "Not Harrington," Sophia corrected gently. "Just Sophia Collins. Now I'm going back to my maiden name." The decision had crystallized that afternoon in the art supply store, when the owner had asked her name for the workshop registration. Without conscious deliberation, she had given her birth name the identity she had carried before marriage, before motherhood, before decades of accommodation had worn away her edges. Reclaiming that name felt like recovering a lost inheritance, a connection to her younger self, to the woman who had dreamed of teaching art, who had painted ambitious canvases in college, who had believed her perceptions and expressions mattered. Not rejection of the life she had lived as Sophia Harrington, but recognition that she was entering a new chapter that called for her original voice. That night she emailed Nathan about her decision, knowing he of all people would understand its significance. His response arrived within hours. "I love it. Mom Collins was always a great name. It fits the artist I remember from childhood. the one who taught me to see shadows as colored rather than just gray. His memory of that specific lesson, offered during a long-ago walk when he was perhaps 7 or 8, touched her deeply. He had been paying attention all those years, noticing her attempts to share her perceptions. Despite the constraints of her circumstances, something of her true self had been transmitted to her son, even through the layers of adaptation her marriage had required. The realization brought both comfort and renewed purpose. Perhaps her years of compromise hadn't been entirely in vain if they had preserved this connection, this sharing of vision across generations. And perhaps her current journey toward authenticity might offer her children, even Isabel, currently resistant and judgmental, a different model for aging, for self-respect, for courage in midlife and beyond. With this thought came a subtle expansion of her perspective. Her awakening wasn't solely personal. It was potentially meaningful to others, navigating similar passages. Not that she needed external justification for her choices, but recognizing their potential ripple effect added dimension to her emerging narrative. She wasn't just reclaiming herself for her own sake, though that would have been reason enough. She was also demonstrating possibility, showing by example that reinvention remained an option. At 63, that identity wasn't fixed by decades of habit, that courage could be cultivated at any age. This awareness didn't burden her awakening with grandiose purpose or self-importance. Rather, it placed her individual journey within a larger context of human growth and transformation, connecting her to others who had found themselves similarly constrained by expectation and routine, similarly hungry for authentic expression in life's later chapters. In this expanded understanding, Sophia began to feel not just personally revitalized, but part of something larger, a quiet revolution of older women reclaiming their right to continued development, to new beginnings, to lives shaped by desire rather than obligation. Not dramatic or attention-seeking, but profound in its implications for cultural narratives about aging, particularly female aging. The Tuesday night art workshop became a touchstone in this emerging community of reinvention. The participants, mostly women between 50 and 75, shared not just techniques and materials, but stories of transition, of loss, converted to opportunity, of identities reconfigured after major life changes. Some were widows, others divorced or newly retired. Some had moved across the country to be near grandchildren. Others had deliberately chosen distance from family obligations. All were engaged in the complex process of determining what mattered now, what new expressions might be possible in this unexpectedly open terrain of later life. In their company, Sophia found both mirrors for her experience and windows into alternative possibilities. Her journey wasn't unique, but neither was it prescribed. Each woman present was improvising her own path through similar questions, creating meaning from the raw materials of her particular circumstances and capacities. One evening, as they cleaned brushes and packed up supplies, a woman named Eleanor, a retired English professor who had recently taken up landscape painting, remarked casually, "You know what I love about this age? The gradual disappearance of should. All those expectations that drove me for decades just don't matter anymore." The simple observation crystallized something Sophia had been feeling but hadn't articulated. The weight of should stay married regardless of personal cost, should prioritize others' comfort above her own needs, should accept diminishment as inevitable. With age, had indeed lifted. Not completely, not without occasional resurgence of guilt or uncertainty, but significantly enough to allow new growth. I'm still learning to recognize when I'm operating from old shoulds. Sophia admitted, "They're sneaky. They disguise themselves as wisdom or practicality." Eleanor nodded. The important question becomes whose voice is that in your head, yours? Or someone else's that you've internalized so completely you mistake it for your own? The question followed Sophia home that night, illuminating habits of thought she had never previously examined. How often had she rejected her own desires or insights because they contradicted expectations she had absorbed from family church community? How frequently had she silenced her authentic response in favor of what she had been taught was appropriate, reasonable, mature? That night she wrote in her journal, "I am learning to distinguish between my genuine voice and the chorus of shoulds I've internalized over decades. When I feel resistance to something I genuinely want, I'm asking, is this my true concern, speaking, or an echo of external judgments I've carried too long? The difference feels like tension versus expansion in my chest, contraction around fear versus opening toward possibility. This internal sorting, separating authentic self from accumulated social conditioning, became central to her awakening process, not rejecting all external wisdom or abandoning ethical principles, but discerning which constraints served genuine values and which merely perpetuated limitations she had outgrown. As autumn deepened toward winter, Sophia's identity reclamation accelerated. She enrolled in a 6-week watercolor intensive at the community college, joined a book group, focused on women's memoir and autobiography, and volunteered at the local elementary school's after-school art program, not from obligation or habit, but from genuine desire to engage with each activity. On days between these commitments, she continued visiting the lake cabin, supervising repairs, making design decisions, gradually transforming the neglected structure into a space that expressed her emerging selfhood. She chose colors that pleased her eye rather than conforming to current trends, arranged rooms according to her own patterns of movement and use, created dedicated space for her artwork rather than relegating it to corners or closets. Each choice represented not just practical decision-making but philosophical declaration. I matter. My preferences matter. My work matters. My comfort matters. After decades of adjusting herself to fit environments designed primarily around others' needs and tastes, she was creating a habitat aligned with her true nature. As the cabin transformation progressed, Sophia found herself spending more time there, sometimes staying overnight, despite the ongoing construction. Even in its unfinished state, the space felt more authentically hers than any home she had inhabited since early adulthood, not because it was perfect or impressive, but because it was entirely hers. Every choice reflecting her values, rather than compromise or convention. One evening, sitting on the partially repaired porch, watching sunset colors reflect on the lake's surface, she experienced a moment of profound peace, not happiness exactly, but something deeper and more substantial, a sense of rightness, of alignment between inner and outer reality, of being precisely where she belonged. She captured the feeling in her journal later. Tonight I understood that home isn't necessarily a physical structure or geographical location. It's the experience of being fully present in one's own life, fully embodied in one's own skin, fully expressive of one's own truth. I am finding my way home to myself, my way.